I need some traction. You need some traction.
Appreciate everybody for joining me today. I'm Russ Armstrong. I'm with Boast.AI. We are actually building software to help automate your R&D tax credit claim process. In Canada, that would be the SHRED program, building software to automate that process, tying into tax. In the US, that's the R&D tax incentive program, both which are still giving money back even in the current environment. So encouraging everybody to kind of take a look at that as another source of funding. So that's where I am. So my background, before I jump into my SaaS sales playbook, I spent 11 years in capital markets as an institutional equity trader for RBC, trading for mutual funds, hedge funds. I kind of lived through the '08 financial crisis, so I've got a few flashbacks in my head right now as I see this. I left the capital markets industry about 5 years ago to launch a startup called Limelight Platforms with a friend of mine in sales and finance there. So, and what I found is, in terms of a sales playbook that was actually out there, I found that it was a lot of disparate pieces of information, and no one really consolidated all of that information into an easy to use guide to really get off the ground in your sales process. So what I did is kind of put down all my best practices and thoughts that I accumulated over the 5-year period and put them into a deck that I can share with people to really jumpstart your sales and, really accelerate your growth for your company. So typically what we find with early stage companies is you see the founders who have domain expertise. Maybe they've recognized a problem within the industry that they've previously worked at, and they have that domain expertise and contacts and networks within it, and they make up the first significant sales of those early stage companies, which is all great and fine as you're proving out your product market fit. But at some point, a CEO and a founder needs to move on from this point person, from all the key sales. So how do you move on from that? How do you turn this into a repeatable, scalable sales process for your team? And that's kind of the goal of what we're going to go over today, is just talking about, how you set up a process, what that should look like, and how that looks like under different scenarios. So when I say repeatable is getting your messaging right and really narrowing down what that value proposition. I'm going to talk about value proposition a lot today. What is the value that you are delivering for your customers? And you're going to have to get that. And it's not as simple as you're going to do it once. It's going to be evolving, especially in the early stages of your company when you're really figuring out product market fit and go-to-market fit. How is that value proposition going to be changing? What are the different segments of the market that is really going to resonate with, where you're going to be able to see that success? So that is the key for that repeatable part. And then the scalable part is, what processes do you have in place for you to add more people to your team to be able to scale this out? So how is everybody going to be on the same page? What material, what ideas are they all referencing when they're going through their sales process? So that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. There's revenue, and growing your revenue kind of goes across the board here. And 3 of your ways to grow your revenue is more customers and more users, which will be our focus today, is what we're really going to be looking at. The other thing you could look at is you're increasing your average selling price and then increasing purchasing frequency. We're going to focus on the first one today, really on those early stage companies, learning how to acquire more customers and users for your product. So first step when you're going through this, and when you have some early data and some early successes, you're really going to have to identify your customer. So your ideal customer profile, so your ICP. You could have possibly more than one ICP, but you're going to want to define these, because you're going to want to get into your buyer's head in terms of what they care about and what they need. So your ICP is going to be industry specific, the types of companies that you're going to be targeting throughout your sales process. And once you have your ICPs, you're going to want to build out buyer personas for those ICPs. And you could have multiple segments, as I just mentioned. So your buyer personas could stretch across it, but you're going to want to get into the head of those buyers who are responsible. And depending on what your solution is, all the way from the spectrum from like a simple SaaS online solution that you buy through clicks all the way to enterprise software, the more complicated the sales process, the more buyer personas are going to be involved in your purchasing and your sales cycle, the more you're going to have to map out to really understand how they buy and how they purchase software for you to be able to increase your sales cycles. So those buyer personas, what are they? They're job titles. They might be targeting, CFOs or marketing departments, whatever it might be. What are the personality traits of those people? What are their responsibilities? How many people do they manage? What are their challenges that they have with their current environment? Is it a technology challenge? Is there a information challenge? Whatever that might be, you want to build these out and really understand what their challenges are, along with their KPIs. And then we're back to that value proposition, which again, I'm going to bring up multiple times today. And this is one of those key things that I always see with early stage companies. You talk about what your product does. And it's not what your product does, it's what value do you bring to your consumer. That's what they really care about. And people always fall back into the trap of what their product does for people. So it's not about that, it's the value you bring to that consumer. Does it make their job easier? Is it faster? Is it cheaper? Is it more efficient? And then quantifying that value proposition. That is the key to really getting inside your buyer's head and being able to deliver a consistent sales process. So why does this matter to this customer? And there's a lot of things, and this can go into tracking and documenting all this, because you're going to want to build out a content map to really feed into this. So what are the trends in the industry that these buyer personas are going to? What is their fear? What keeps them up at night? What is the fear of missing out? Is the whole industry moving in a certain way? Are they not aware? Are they not educated about it? Is it a return on investment that they're worried about, and actually building out some of that stuff? And then what you need to support all this is a content library that supports the buyer journey throughout this cycle. And we'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation today. All right, we're going to talk about styles of positioning real quick. And this is just a quick synopsis of kind of where you live in terms of the spectrum. So, there's three that we kind of generally talk about. One is like head-to-head, where you're competing. I always say competition is great. Competition is a good thing, especially in a large market. That means that there is an actual market out there. That means it's proven. That means VCs are funding it. That means that there is, a clear market where you can sell into. So this is key on that head-to-head side. You're just going to have to come up with a better execution strategy than the next person to win in that space. Second kind of segment and positioning is big fish, small pond. We talk about CRMs for example, we have Salesforce, which is clearly a market leader. But if you think about how many actual CRM systems are out there for separate little niches, like dentists, like lawyers, like accountants, who have a certain set of features or sub features that is not available for on Salesforce, or would cost too much to implement. That's where you get into this big fish, small pond, where you're able to describe what your value proposition is very easily. The hardest by far, but also can have the most upside in terms of your growth, is category creation. So that is creating a whole new space and a whole new way to think about it. And this has to do with a lot of education, because typically in the category creation side, your buyers don't even recognize they have a problem yet. So you have to educate them that they have a problem, that there is a better solution to do it. And then you have to educate on how easy it is to implement that solution, which is always a difficult sales process. It takes longer. There's usually more people involved in that process. So that's the category creation side. So when I go back to this value proposition, what you really need to be able to do is, in simple terms, describe the value that provide the user. So I have a great example here. You got to get rid of the lingo. So this is one of the things I always stress to people. When you talk to half the world, I mean, if you're in tech, you're obviously going to know what a ride sharing marketplace is. But when you're talking to a lot of people that are like, marketplace, I'm like, I'm not totally familiar with that. Ride sharing, okay. That's not value proposition for me. A value proposition is getting a ride in 4 minutes or less. But let's dive into this even further. This is when Uber went public on their S1 filing. This is what they talked about in terms of what their value proposition was. That it was a platform where you have a safe, reliable, affordable, and convenient trip within a few minutes of tapping a button. Now, those value propositions, those words, safe, reliable, affordable, convenient, everybody gets that. The value proposition is extremely, extremely apparent in what they're doing. They're not talking about ride sharing marketplaces. They're talking about the value that they're delivering for their end user. And that's what you need to really be able to dive into and dissect with your solution when you're trying to go to market with it. So how to positioning. So we're just going to do a little quick one on this. And this is an exercise you guys can kind of take at home and kind of put it together here. Just a notes to really try to, document and get the ball rolling and building out what your process is going to be. So from a competitive analysis, this is one of the key ones. If you didn't exist, what would your consumers use? Would they use another solution? Would they be doing it manually? What is the workflow that you're currently replacing with your solution? If you're automating a workflow, how is it currently done? How long does it take? Show the pain points. And this is when you can start to create great content ideas about showing people the pain that they're experiencing without them even realizing it. So this is a good one to start off with. The second one is your key attributes. So what features or capabilities do you have that the alternatives don't have? So this could be, if you're doing it pen and paper, you're automating that workflow, or you're having certain sub features that are only relevant. Take that CRM example again. Maybe it's only relevant for real estate agents or insurance brokers, and there's a certain subcategory where these features are really, really important for. Again, that's a cool one. And then back to that value. Again, you're gonna hear me talk about value proposition so much here. The value that these attributes enable for your customers. What are they getting out of it? Is it cheaper? Is it better? Is it faster? Let's dive into that. Tell me what this is and prove to me why that's what it is. And then what is that customers who care? So again, back to the ICP and the buyer personas, write those down, start to get that going, start to think about who those people are. Almost all the successful people I talk to who have gone on to raise Series A, Series B are ruthless about getting in front of their customers and talking to their customers about what they care about, what they need, what their product works, how it all works. So get in front of those customers and talk to them, because you need to understand that ICP and that buyer persona to really drive product growth. And then what context makes your value obvious to your customers? So how are you going to scale it in terms of the market context? All right, so that's just some exercises and kind of like the preliminary work you need to do before you go into it. I'm going to talk about the sales process a little bit more. And this is kind of across the board in terms of your business development team. So you're going to see your different departments. So within your marketing departments, within your business development reps, within your account executives, and your customer success. All these are massive, important pieces of the puzzle for growing your sales. But I've kind of dissected down into what are the activities that these people are doing, so you can start to kind of quantify the results and thinking about who should be responsible for what as you start to build out your scalable, repeatable sales process. So on your marketing side, you have your SEOs, webinars, events, PR, social, organic, paid, and the KPIs you're tracking against those are in MQL. So a marketing qualified lead, and we'll go into that a little bit later. For your BDRs or your SDRs, inbound qualification or outbound lead generation is what the activities that they'll be doing, and their KPIs are SQLs and SALs, and the opportunities that they're booking and the meetings that they're booking, and those are the things that they're going to be measured on in terms of success. For the account executives, this is when that pass off happens from that SDR or BDR to that account executive. The account executive is going to be responsible for demos, for workshops, for negotiating and handling objections from those buyers to help navigate that sales process. And obviously, the more enterprise and the larger the contract value, the longer that sales process is, which means that account executive needs to be even more dialed into what that buyer is doing. And they're against bookings is what their primary KPI is. And then a massive, massive piece of this is obviously your customer success. No one wants to see a churn rate that's high. So being able to deliver on that value proposition and nurture that client, depending on, the type of industry you're selling in or how you're selling it. There's two types where it's like, you grab a toehold and then you might have 90% of your upside in growth and selling across the organization versus selling in across the organization in a fell swoop. That customer success piece is so key to deliver a great experience if you're going to sell across that organization and upsell across it. So some of the KPIs that they can be measured on is that upsell, renewals, churn, and NPS, your net promoter score. So here's some of the metrics that you're going to need to calculate. And the way we do this and the way we think about this is your customer acquisition cost. But you also have to think of this in terms of cohorts, especially in the early stages of your company. You're going to be pivoting quite often in terms of messaging, trying new targets, trying new thought leadership pieces. So you're going to have this in terms of cohorts. You're going to want to measure your customer acquisition cost across your different cohorts, across different periods of time. Again, with that, you're going to want to have your LTV and your ARPU. Sometimes, in early stage companies, I get this question a lot around, calculating your lifetime value. Sometimes that's really hard to do in those early stages. What you're really going to want to do is just estimate this, because you might not be able to have this. So you're going to have to put a best guess together that you're going to have to work against, because you're not going to have enough data to complete it. But put a best guess together, which is a conservative estimate, state your assumptions and work off of that, because you're going to need to work with something. You can't work with nothing. So obviously the ratio you're going to be shooting for is a 3-to-1 ratio. Here's a quick graph on kind of what that means. At a CAC to LTV at 1-to-1, you're just paying back your customer acquisition cost. At a 2-to-1, you're now making money, and 3-to-1 is kind of where you're targeting, is what you really want to see in terms of that growth and hockey stick growth on a 3-to-1 payback ratio. So the different types of sales team structures, in the early days of your company, you're not going to have enough resources. So we call that an island approach, where your sales executives are going to be end to end, where you're going to be prospecting, converting, closing, activating, kind of across the board. You're going to be in customer success. You're going to kind of be in every aspect of it. And then as you mature a little bit more, you can move into more specialized roles like assembly lines, where you'll have, marketing, BDRs, AEs passing off to customer success. So that's generally what you'll see as a sequence as you start to get more mature as a company. And then you'll move into even more segmented pods. Like I said, you might have multiple targets that you're going after. You might have different types of buyer profiles. So at Limelight Platforms, we were selling marketing technology. We could sell to enterprise, or we could sell to agency. Very, very different KPIs, very, very different users, different types of sales processes going into both of those different people. So we had different pods for those different segments. We could even segment it into to have, industry experts across finance versus automotive, because of the lingo, because of some of the questions that they would ask around the purchasing cycle. So we developed pods around those different go-to-market strategies for the different verticals that we were selling into. Rule of thumb is you want to have a pod revenue 2 times the salary cost within those pods. That's for down the road, for sure. So here's an interesting thing that kind of, we discuss out there in terms of your sales design. I mean, the previous culture in sales before SaaS and before it really came out, you'd always have superstars. And the superstar sales culture is, the guy who can sell anything to anybody, who can talk to anybody, who gets along with everybody and can just find a way to relate to that buyer to sell it. That is not something that is scalable and repeatable, because it's a unique attribute of that person. So designing a process around superstar culture will result in failure. What you do is kind of work backwards in terms of that pyramid and build it on a science culture. And that science culture starts with process. It starts with messaging. It starts with getting the right team in place, building technology to support that, enabling your team to really build out that process in the opposite way of a superstar culture. And that's what that kind of is all about. This is one of my favorite graphs of all times. It really kind of helps you understand where you live in terms of the spectrum of your go-to-market strategy. Some interesting thoughts here. Across the bottom, you have your average contract value. So in terms of if you have a very low-cost solution that you're providing to the market, obviously your customer acquisition cost is also going to have to be extremely low to be able to have that 3-to-1 ratio or greater in the market. So if you have a low ACV, you're going to be over on the freemium or web sales, online sales kind of world in terms of what you should be thinking about in terms of strategies of your go-to-market strategy. The very transactional sales, so you're not really getting involved with a whole lot of human interaction. Once you start to get into the inside sales, where you're around like the 12,500 ACV to 25,000, that's when you can start to think about a low cost inside sales team. And that low cost inside sales team will then start using methodologies for selling, like solution selling or consultative selling, where they're selling in as a trusted advisor, more so than just trying to hammer home a transactional sale. And that's where you can start to build those out. And then as you start to get even greater in terms of the field sales and local sales, you can really start to, you can start to see your customer acquisition costs really increase across those. So like, think about it, for example, if your customers are buying enterprise software where those contracts could be $1 million a year on 3-year deals, that's, 3 million in LTV, your customer acquisition cost can be, quite high to be able to support that. So you can hire teams, you can have local sales, you can try very, very expensive techniques to try and convert those, where you're going to conferences, you're going to those webinars, you're traveling a lot, you're on the road a lot, but that will support that because those deal sales are that high. So interesting. And then with those, you're going to see more strategies around account-based marketing, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in this, and also provocative selling techniques, where you're getting people to really question the process that they're currently doing. Are you doing it right? Is there a better solution out there? Is there a more efficient way, where you're trying to find that champion who will adopt some change and grow with you? So that's really what you're doing with this. So this is one of my favorite ones. And then again, we think about this in terms of segments. So if you break this out, you might have a segment that has an ACV. So when I go back to that Limelight example, we're selling to agencies. They might have a different ACV target than what my enterprise clients do. My enterprise might pay me $1 million a year. My agencies might pay me, 50, 100,000 a year. And if that's the case, I'm going to have different selling strategies, different go-to-market strategies for those different segments, because it's not going to, you can't spend the same type of money attracting those two markets and converting those customers. So your customer acquisition cost and segmenting them out. And then on top of that, you're going to want those cohorts, because if you do adopt and you're iterating quickly on your cycle, your messaging, your content, you're going to want to be able to track the success across those cohorts as they move through your funnel. Lots coming at you here. All right, so just some definitions here, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the definitions, because we're going to send this deck out and the recording, so you can kind of dive into those after. One of the biggest things I get is like, what's the difference between web-based sales and online sales? Web-based sales is more so where people can find the solutions they want within the content or your FAQs on your website, where online sales might be chatbots or human interaction, phone calls directly based off of the online sales, versus an inside sales team, which is that next level, where you have an outbound sequence and an outbound process which you're following. So it kind of just separates it by those different areas. And then in terms of sales styles, this is like, the fastest I could bring this to you, but there are people who have wrote books on each one of these types of sales methodologies. So you could dive into this forever, but here's the kind of like the broad examples of what they are. Again, if we go back to this slide here, if you're kind of falling within these different categories, this is where you're going to see those different methodologies applied in your go-to-market strategy. So you can kind of streamline those processes to make sure that you're following the right one. All right, let's talk on account-based marketing really quickly. So the whole idea of account-based marketing is flipping your funnel upside down. So your original funnel is, you have a top of funnel prospects, and then you have middle of funnel, and then your bottom of funnel. The opposite of that is, let's flip it upside down and identify the companies that fit into my ICP, my ideal customer profile. Identify the companies first. Second, who do I need to contact at these companies who are involved in the buying process, the decision-making process? Identifying those people and then targeting those people. And then you engage those key players, and then you're creating champions and advocates for your product and service within those people, and then selling it that way. It's the opposite of just trying to find someone at the top and, flipping your funnel upside down. So that's the account-based selling. The account-based selling, you can have low-cost account-based selling strategies to extremely high-cost account-based selling strategies. And there's some great tools and resources out there in the market to kind of help you identify that. So you can take a very hyper-targeted ABM approach to your selling process in a lower cost way. It does not have to break the bank to do ABM all the time. So you can look into that a little bit more. I always talk about the circle of influence in terms of buyers and how they do it. And the higher you get on the spectrum of ACV for your deal size, the larger and more influential you're going to have to be in this circle of influence to complete those sales. You're going to have to, and I always kind of rule of thumb, I found that if I could connect with somebody, my buyer, in 3 separate mediums, um, independent of each other. So if they saw us in the PR, they saw us on social, and they saw us at a conference, my ability to open up a conversation with those people based off of them seeing us in 3 separate non-affiliated ways was always greater. And being able to complete this circle of influence, if you're a buyer and you see somebody everywhere, your likelihood of picking up the phone, answering an email, having a conversation, getting in front of them is going to dramatically increase. So you want to kind of identify this from a grand perspective and have a strategy to try and get in front of those clients from a full circle of influence kind of thought process. All right, so let's get into the definitions, and this is where it gets a little bit deeper here in terms of how you're tracking the data. The data for your process is so key to help you understand what's working and what's not working, especially with the number of iterations that you're going to have throughout your process. For you to put out a new landing page to see if it works, some new content, a new white paper, a new infographic that's really helping drive home the value proposition of what you're selling, you're going to have to be able to track this across to understand where you're succeeding, where your process is breaking down. So if we define the sales funnel kind of through like awareness, education, selection, and then you've committed, and then this is your onboarding, use, and grow on the other side. And that's the customer success, the upsell, the account management side of it. So here are the definitions that we kind of look at. So a prospect, an MQL, a marketing qualified lead, a sales qualified lead, a sales accepted lead. So those are the definitions that we're looking at. So let's define these a little bit for you. And the key to having clear definitions for your team, obviously, is, as they always say with any data and anything you're trying to analyze, garbage in, garbage out. If people are following different rules, then your data is not going to be usable across your organization. People have to have set rules and set definitions for what qualifies for those certain targets for you to be able to make use of the data. So have these clearly communicated and easily accessible for your entire team, so everybody is following the same steps. So your prospect, obviously, these are the people who are at the very top of your funnel, people who you want to talk to, or people who have done something on your website, or who are before you've actually had that first touch. MQL, a marketing qualified lead. This is when your marketing is really getting involved here. These are, there's 2 types of MQLs that kind of go in, and you can do some scoring once you get, a little bit further down the road in terms of scoring those actions where you'll track their profile. So time sensitive calls to actions, such as maybe it was a hand raiser. They said, they're on your website and it said, contact me, or I want to speak to somebody, or not time sensitive, such as downloading a white paper or downloading some content because you have educational pieces on your website, and that might be a not now type piece. Or maybe you have a score where if that person downloads 3 white papers in a row, now it's time to call them. You can score those. Again, it's tracking the data on these to see what your conversion cycles are on those to optimize your process throughout. Sales qualified leads. So, this is your next step. This is usually when it starts to get handed off from your BDR who's trying to qualify them before it gets into that SAL piece where it gets handed off to that account executive. The SQL kind of metric is what we're looking at when we're talking about a BANT process. So BANT is just an acronym for qualifying somebody. You can use, budget, authority, time, and price. So do they have a budget for this? So these are kind of the things, need. These are the kind of things that you want to qualify across that buyer when you're having those discovery calls to really pull out, are they a good buyer? And one of the biggest places where people fall down is figuring out that timeline to purchase, that sense of urgency. When are they going to be able to pull the trigger on buying this? Have they bought it before? Time kills all deals. It's the number one reason why a deal falls through is that it just gets stale in a pipeline and there's no urgency anymore. So trying to be able to identify that urgency is a key piece of the sales process. The sales accepted lead is when a salesperson, account executive has talked to that person and has qualified them. So this is them getting to a point where they've talked to them, they've hit the BANT kind of criteria, and they're moving them down the funnel into a SAL, a sales accepted lead, where they're going to try and close a deal with them. or there's a possibility that they're not ready yet and they go back into a nurturing program where you'll send them content and educational pieces again until they're ready to really talk to a buyer or an account executive at that point. So what you're doing at this point is you're really tracking your conversion metrics across your funnel. So how many MQLs convert to SQLs, how many SQLs convert to SALs, how many SALs actually buy the product. You're going to want to calculate these and track these, because you also want to track by cohorts, because if you release different tools, different products, different features, different messaging, you're going to want to understand how that's impacting your entire funnel, because you're going to want to isolate and fix the problems. If you get a whole bunch of people to SAL and nobody buys, well, you got a problem at the bottom of your funnel that you need to fix. If you can't get enough people to convert from MQLs to SQLs, well, you got to look at that and identify what those problems are. Maybe it's more content, maybe it's more education, or maybe your messaging is really, really weak at that point in the funnel and you need to go back to the drawing board to fix it. So tracking your sales conversion metrics across your funnel is key to your process as well. And then when we map the buyer journey, what you're going to need to do is really get into that buyer and that buyer persona's kind of thought process in terms of what content am I going to need to consume at the different stages of the funnel for me to convert into a buyer. So at the top of funnel, are they, depending on what you're selling and where you are on the spectrum, if you're category creation, you're doing a lot of, really high level infographics, some customer pain point stories. As you move into the middle of funnel, you're going to have more educational guides, comparison guides, some white papers. And then as you move into the bottom of funnel, you might have case studies with ROI calculators. You might go into user stories of how easy it is to implement, depending on who you're targeting. I mean, if you're targeting a solution and you need to have buy-in from the IT and security team, you could have content that specifically targets them, that has user stories about how easy it is to implement, how great the customer success team is, that kind of stuff, to get buy-in from across the organization. It will help you across the board. All right. So from that, I'm going to jump into just some industry averages. I guess the one thing I'd like to highlight also, in terms of when you start to really grow out your sales team, your first sales hire or your first key sales hire is an interesting one, because especially when you're in your early stages of a company, your product's going to be evolving. The features are going to be evolving. Your messaging is going to be evolving. So getting that right salesperson early, who is used to change, who is used to the dynamic nature of being in an early stage company, is so key to help you grow and grow your business. So that's a key part of it in your early stage. So someone who's going to be involved in product, who's going to be involved in engineering, who's going to be involved in marketing, who understands how that impacts it. Again, when I talk to all the successful CEOs out there and how involved they are with their customers and getting that customer feedback, it is so imperative that you have early people in your sales process that are also going to mimic that behavior, who are involved, who are entrenched in providing feedback across the organization. That feedback is what's really going to get you that product market fit that's really solid. I think product market fit, I don't always necessarily think about it in terms of like a static, like it's not a black and white yes or no. There's a spectrum of product market fit. Your product market fit might be, weak, it might be medium, and it might be extremely strong. And where are you on that spectrum? And sometimes you're trying to move towards the strong spectrum, and it might be features that you don't have the capital or cash flow to build until you're down the road at year 2, or you raised a Series A to really tackle those. But in those early stages, what is that product market fit, and how are you moving it across? What are your customers saying that's really going to drive value for them? And then how are you moving your product to a 10 out of 10 on a product market fit score? Because a 10 out of 10 on a product market fit score is something that's revolutionary, something that's, that executives aren't going to say no to. Your conversion rates are going to go up. And that had a lot to do with it. If you're going to be stuck in like the 1 or 2 value creation in terms of that product market fit score, people can say no to you and they're still going to have their job. You versus the alternative is not going to deliver enough of that value proposition to really make them need to change, or fear of not selecting a new solution for what they're doing. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that on early hires. But I also thought it was quite important to kind of share, some details around your AEs and your ramp up, just in terms of when you're going to market. So how long does it take for AEs to ramp up? So if you're doing some budgeting and some cash flow, you got to think about, someone's got to fill their pipe. On average, 3 to 5 months is what we typically see for most people, most AEs, to ramp up and have a pipeline to start to being, actually delivering. On the flip side of that, if tenure is only like 2.4 years, that means in your modeling for how you're growing your sales team, you're going to have a ramp up period of 3 to 5 months every 2.4 years for your sales reps. So it's not just 1+1=2. You add another guy and he's ramped up right away. So just keep that in mind with some of your forecasting. Obviously, this one is kind of around your, OSDR, your outbound sales development reps. So your SDRs. The higher the ACV, the more likely you are going to have an SDR team. Makes sense because you have a customer acquisition cost that you can work with that's going to support that. So totally makes sense. As your ACV goes up, you're going to have more customer acquisition costs to play with. You're going to have more of a assembly line type team to go to market with. On the flip side of that, when you start to get into the enterprise world, the larger the ACV, the average contract size, the less of your pipeline is going to be sourced from marketing. And that's because that circle of influence is so much greater than just what you're doing in a marketing sense, that you're going to have field reps, people in the market, people making relationships and networks within those local markets, especially when you start to get into think about an ERP software, selling that SAP software, NetSuite. They're selling, $5-10 million software solutions to clients. They're spending months with those buyers, understanding what their needs are. You're not going to get any of those solutions from marketing. It's just not possible. So this kind of makes sense too, but just kind of putting some graphics inside of it. If you're tracking your data and they're not lining up with what these industry averages are, you should be asking yourself why. When do I need an assembly line? It's a great question as well. So as you can see, as you start to grow higher on your ACV, the more likely you're going to have an assembly line and have your SDRs in place. So as you grow from 100K, at the 100K plus ACV level, 83% of teams have an assembly line. So an SDR that hands off to an account executive. Another interesting one, just make sure you understand your payment and how you're paying your teams, which is always a tough one at an early stage company, just because if you're just developing your go-to-market strategy and your forecasts, it's very difficult to put numbers in terms of those targets down against those. So, being able to hit that OTE, that on target earning number, is critical to keeping those team members for at least those 2.4 years. Obviously, if you're not going to be able to have people hit those OTEs, then you're going to have your tenure rates even go lower than that, where you're going to have even more ramp up and wasted onboarding time before you have fully contributing sales reps. So these are some numbers that we put together, in terms of base salaries and OTEs and what that mix is for those people in terms of that salary compensation. I think one of the key things also with those early stage companies is to have some flexibility about making sure those clients hit those targets, making sure your employees hit those targets. If you want to keep people happy, and I'll get into that a little bit in terms of performance and measuring it. Sometimes you can't measure the sales necessarily because maybe your product's not ready to go full into market, or maybe it's more important for you at this point to get a new logo, get a customer who wants to grow with you, who buys into your vision, who buys into the solution that you're going to build over the next 5 years. Maybe it's more important getting that logo and getting that user and that feedback. So you're not going to capture, maybe you're going to discount that price by, 50, 75%. And if you're doing that, now you're not comping your rep fully. So how are you making up the backfill on that? And these are the things, the conversations you're going to have. If you have a good sales rep, treat them well and, make up that difference on discretionary bonus to make sure they're getting whole. And this is what I was talking about here in terms of measuring performance. You can't always just go off that revenue number. You got to measure multiple things across the pipeline. So you got to measure, the conversion funnel. Are our conversion metrics good? Are they improving? Are we making changes and iterations to help make those even better? And you can manage activities, but not always results. Managing activities is, are we having enough conversations? Are they qualified conversations? Maybe you haven't quite hit that product market fit yet, and it's not quite perfect. So you can only manage the activities and the iterations around going into really try to solidify what that product market fit and that go-to-market strategy really should be. All right. So, and then just some activity levels. And this is, again, this is more for ramped up teams where you actually have a fully functioning team in place. And these are some averages just that were put out there from the team. So just some numbers here for everybody to kind of take a look at. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on those because we'll probably get to some Q&A pretty shortly. This is another key thing just in terms of the sales enablement tools that are out there for teams and what people can use to really increase the velocity of their sales team. When you look at this, what we're looking at here is the people who, the first tools that people buy to help people with their automation is email automation, tracking, and cadences. So your cadences would be the sequence that you're going to send somebody over a 1, 2, 3, 4 week period and what those touch points are. So that's the first piece of software that people are typically buying. Second piece of software that people are spending money on is contact data and account intelligence. Obviously, this is key for your finding out the prospect information from your ICP and buyer personas. So getting accurate information, accurate phone numbers to help with your process. Third piece of information or software people are buying is, Adobe eSign or DocuSign or something like that. And this always, depending on the number of deals you're doing, obviously in the early stages, this would matter more so if you have a high volume of transactions versus a low volume of transactions. You're not going to need the same type of e-signature solutions in place. And then you can see here, LinkedIn Navigator is kind of the next thing people go to. Click to dial. Call recording and conversation analytics like gong.io is really down funnel a lot more. Advanced forecasting, pipeline analytics, and then finally kind of the leading people who are really spending the money in gamification and leaderboards to really gamify the whole sales process is what people are spending on the high end of it. Here's some typical packages that we see people spending money on. Again, you're going to have to bake this into your costs. The efficiency that people get from these velocity tools are amazing. So you definitely want to spend the money on it or find a way to kind of bring that in to the realm of what your team is using to increase the velocity of their outreach. And then obviously, as you start to move up the chain in terms of like what people are spending on the leadership roles within their teams. So think about this from like, OTE perspectives of, different levels. So, for VP of sales in 2017, I should get some updated data here, but about 250 level for a VP of sales, the director level 176 and the manager 138 level. Just some ballparks to keep in mind when you're doing those plannings. If there's any founders on the call here, when you're doing your forecasting, you're going to have to put some of these numbers in place. So these are some good placeholders to kind of think about in terms of those forecasts down the road. So with that, I kind of going to wrap it up there. I know there was a whole lot kind of within the presentation here, and I kind of figured I'd open it up to some questions at this point. And, I might not be able to get to all of them, but again, you can kind of, the deck will be going out and you can always reach me. You can connect with me on LinkedIn as well. I've got some other content on there that I'd be happy to share, a pipeline velocity guide, and even on the financing side, I have Entrepreneur's Guide to Fundraising, how to create pitch decks. So a bunch of content that's free on my LinkedIn page. If you want to check it out, happy to share that kind of stuff. But yeah, let's jump into some questions and answers at this point. And let's see.
So one of the questions here is, how does one settle against clients who are afraid and feel the need to contract right now? What are you guys seeing? What are you doing in this environment?
Yeah, this is what the financial industry likes to call a black swan event, where it's an event that you're not going to be able to, the 2008 financial crisis was a black swan event. Although if you watch The Big Short, they try to make it like everybody knew it was going to happen. But if everybody knew it was going to happen, no one would have, everybody would have made money off of it. It wouldn't have happened. So this is what they call a black swan event. We are in an unprecedented time. People don't have data around what it is. You can very easily see from the market the sectors that are getting hit the worst, which will help you with your forecasts. Everybody can see, stocks like Netflix, stocks like Zoom, stocks that are cloud-based like Atlassian, they have hung in really well. Amazon, because they're still functioning pretty fully within this period. When you move to the opposite side of the spectrum, any software that's supporting the live event industry, conference industry, travel industry, airlines, bookings, those are the industries that are getting hitting hardest. So within those, you're going to understand the context of which market you're selling into to be able to come up with your own forecasts. For some of those industries that are hardest hits, it's going to grind to a zero, versus for some of those industries that are booming because of this, I would imagine the Zoom sales desk is probably full speed and blowing their targets out of the water. So I think it's kind of one of those things, you just got to see where you live on the spectrum to really understand how it impacts what you're doing.
Awesome. A few more questions here and they're continuing to roll in. Best KPIs you've seen for entering new markets?
Best KPIs for entering new markets. So if you're testing like a new segment, you're going to want to have those early conversations quickly. I mean, we always have a philosophy of fail fast. So get in front of as many people and have as many conversations as possible to really understand it. Sometimes you might have to do that with, providing, every conversation is a value kind of thing. So when you're trying to find something from a potential target or potential segment, you have to provide value to that person to be able to get there. So providing some sort of massive discount or discounted option to really help you break in and understand how that buyer behaves is pretty key for you to grow into that. So I think the same metrics apply. I just think the data that you need when you're breaking into a new segment is very much more going to be pulled from like deep conversations that you're going to have with those buyers to understand what they're really looking for. It's not going to be as much of the process data, like down funnel data. It's going to be more of like the qualitative stuff that you can get from a real conversation with a buyer.
Awesome. What are the top 3 mistakes you've seen in sales teams?
Top 3 mistakes in sales teams. This is kind of it's an interesting one. I think the most difficult thing is really understanding your product market fit and where you kind of fit in, and your go-to-market strategy. Sometimes early success can be attributed to multiple factors, and if your early success is attributed to potentially some network effect sales or some domain expertise sales, and then you don't really have your process, your content, your go-to-market strategy nailed down yet, with a lot of proven data, and then you extrapolate on that thinking you're ready to scale, when really you're not ready to scale yet. You haven't been in front of enough customers. You haven't sold enough customers to really understand the pain of where they are now and the pain of where they're going in the future. And it's premature trying to scale. You're not ready to scale and you're trying to scale a team. So you start hiring 2 or 3 people at a time. And I think that's the biggest failure people see, is you really got to be ready to scale. And I think that ready to scale thing becomes a little later in the cycle than what most VCs want, what most entrepreneurs want. They want to be like, oh, well, I'm at $1 million in ARR. I should be at 3 next year. Well, sometimes you need to kind of take a step back to really understand, what needs to be built for me to not then go from like, maybe you only go to 2 next year, but you have exponential growth and hockey stick growth after that. So I think that's one of the key things that I see a lot of the times, is people kind of jump the gun on when they're ready to scale it.
Awesome. Any insight into how to move from a low-cost self-onboarding SaaS model to an AE type model where product differentiation is either low or none?
Well, so I mean, I guess here's the sense of it. So you really got to follow what your buyer's willing to pay in that sense, right? So because moving to a inside sales team, your customer acquisition cost is going to increase dramatically. So if the lifetime value of your customer will never get you in a position where you're at a 3-to-1 ratio, then I don't know how you'd ever get to an inside sales team and have that make sense. So that's kind of the, the basis of it. If your buyers aren't going to give you the money, then you can't really move to that spectrum. It's going to be really, really difficult. That's not to say that you don't have a solution. Maybe you could go up market into enterprise or into, mid market and sell into them where your ACV is going to be a lot higher. But you're going to have to understand those buyers. You're going to have to understand the product market fit. It could be very, very, very different than what you're currently selling into on a B2C kind of level, or on a web sales kind of piece.
What are you seeing right now in this current environment in terms of outbound and cold email? What are your recommendations for amid COVID-19 outbreak, and how do you see the sales email campaigns being reshaped here? What are we doing, kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, again, I guess it comes back to how impacted your industry is. Again, it comes back, I mean, as with anything in sales process, the more personalized and the more your buyer, your client, the more likely of success you're going to have. The more, vanilla, plain scripted blast to everybody, the less uptake, the less your conversions are going to be. Again, that's going to depend. If you know something specific about a company and you're trying to sell them, you're going to have more success here. Again, if you're trying to sell into, the C-vent space, splash, that kind of space right now, they're going to be shut off right now. They're not going to have any buying authority whatsoever. They're going to be on complete lockdown. So I think it's just knowing your client, know where they are, understand their business, understand where they are and some of the things they're going through. And that's from a macro level. You're never going to know from a company specific level. They could have cash flow issues because a round just fell through or whatever it might be. But just understanding the dynamics of your company and who you're going after always helps you in your sales process.
Five sales KPIs to be tracking. What do you see are most important?
The five. I mean, really, I guess there's always, based off the size of the team and how, long you've been at it, obviously, you could track data on every single activity a sales team does, but you're not going to sell anything then because you're just tracking all the data. So I think in terms of the team size, you kind of have to take that into account. What data can I track that is realistic, that's not going to be bogging down my team, that's still going to be efficient, but still gives me the insights that I need to grow my company. And then I think as you start to get larger, you start to have, revenue operations. When you can get into the revenue operations kind of side where you have a full-time person doing that, you can really dive into the data around it. But I don't know, it really just depends on where you are in your company and how many resources you have. If your sales team is 3 or 4 people, you can only track so much. But you do want to track the conversions. Like at a bare minimum, you got to be tracking your conversion metrics across your cycle and the different cohorts. Absolutely, especially at early stages, your messaging changes, your ideas change, and you got to measure that across, because some things might resonate that you didn't think would, and some things that you thought would work won't work. So understanding that is kind of like a bare minimum, and then dissecting that further as you mature as a company, obviously when you hire more resources.
Super. What tool do you wish you had right now, and what kind of data?
What tool do I wish I had right now? What kind of data? So, I mean, I guess it depends again. Like, I think conversation analytics is a very, very cool tool, but you need to have a large team in place on a very scripted process for you to understand and how to use that. If you're not, if you don't have the team in place and using that scripted technology, it's not going to help you as much in terms of the output you're going to get from it. But I do think that's really cool and kind of advanced stuff. As a basic, when we were talking about some of the things, I'll give a plug to a couple solutions out there in terms of sales enablement tools like SalesLoft that plug into Salesforce. That's a great tool to kind of set it up in terms of the different cadences and segments that you want to go after. You can track data, A/B testing, Outreach, Apollo, or similar tools that sit on top of your CRM. I just say one of the key things you want to do is make sure that your solution integrates from your, across your entire stack. So you're not duplicating data entry when you go to set it up. So, Salesforce, SalesLoft integrates, which is a great stack to start with.
What are your thoughts on selling to influencers versus check writers?
Selling to influencers versus check writers. So I guess that's kind of growing your brand recognition, brand presence. If I go back to my circle of influence, there is a place for everything. And what you want to do as your resources grow is optimize all your channels. So you're going to want to be selling to everybody. You want to be selling to influencers. You're going to want to be selling PR, community, events, direct, whatever it might be, whatever that circle of influences, all those different things. You're going to want to have a strategy for every single one of those channels. How am I targeting and surrounding this person in the circle of influence to ensure that sale? So, I don't think it's one or the other. It's how are you hitting all of these things? And that again is with the stage of your company. As you grow, you're going to want to target, different channels and put more emphasis in certain channels. In your early stages, I would not be spending my budget on influencers unless I had data to support that this was, a key component or a KPI of selling into this industry. You'd have to have supporting data to support that. Otherwise, I would say that going after the person who's writing the check, who's the actual end buyer, is a better strategy.
I need some traction.